We had no sooner left the edge of the wood than a volley of bullets whistled past our noses and cracked into the trees behind. 5 or 6 cries behind me. 5 or 6 of my gray lads collapsed on the grass. Damn it, this was serious. The firing seemed at long range, and half left. "Forward!" I shouted, taking my place with 3 of my staff 10 paces in front of the section leader, and the section in well-extended formation 10 paces behind him again. Here we were, advancing as if on a parade ground. A sharp, rapid hammering sound, then a pause, then more rapid hammering. Machine guns. Over to our left, the rifle and machine gun fire was even more intense, the roar of guns and bursting shells increasing. A real battle this time. Through all these 3 barrages of intense fire, our men marched quite steadily, as if nothing was in the way, as if they were under review. At every step, men fell, and our trenches here are very far apart from the German. But our steady, steadfast soldiers, true to the death, paraded in more than decimated numbers through and across the 3rd barrage. Men marching as if on parade into the muzzles of machine guns and through the path of heavy artillery fire. It's one of the most alien, gruesome, and seemingly cruel images of the First World War, and it lends a great credence to an otherwise largely debunked narrative of the war being an affair of lions being led by donkeys. But as usual with the First World War, the reality is more complicated than the popular perception. Yes, soldiers did often walk rather than run into battle. But there were reasons for them to do so, and in this video, brought to you by the Native Oak, I'd like to explain some of them. As is often the case, many of our answers lie within the material and technological circumstances behind the First World War, and specifically the Western Front, which is what this video is really about, and which is so novel in military history. To start with, we have a reason that I've already covered at length in a previous video. Because of how limited communications technology was at the time, while the war itself was so impossibly complex, it meant that large portions of the war needed to be dictated not by instant, in this case radio communications, but by timetables. The artillery will start opening fire at precisely such and such time before the infantry steps off at this other time in coordination with the cavalry that'll set off at this point and this time, so on and so forth. If the infantry aren't moving according to their schedule, either too slowly or too quickly, well then they could outpace their own support. They could run into enemy positions that hadn't yet been cleared. They could be too far behind the artillery, meaning that by the time the artillery fire lifted, the enemy would be able to get to their firing steps and destroy them on open field, or they could even run directly into their own artillery fire, which was immediately in front of them. Again, if any of that sounds confusing, or if you'd like to learn more details on that, especially the artillery thing, well, that's a topic of an earlier video, so I don't want to repeat myself too much here. But beyond concerns of inter-unit coordination, there were a lot of other really important, great reasons why soldiers might not want to run in battle, even if they're being hit hard by the enemy out in the open. One of them would be concerns over the distance that these battles might be taking place over. Now, in some parts of the Western Front, you might expect to see the opposing trench lines right up against one another, really only leaving enough space between them to prevent the other side from just tossing a grenade over from the safety of their trench. Although even then, I'm sure there are exceptions. But at their greatest extent, though, you could see opposing trench lines being hundreds of yards apart. Suffice to say that if the enemy positions are, 2 or even 300 plus yards distant, well, there's no way that the average soldier in any of the armies is going to be capable, with all of their heavy kit especially, to run full tilt across that field and arrive at the end ready to fight the defenders, potentially even in hand-to-hand combat. Instead, you want to make sure that you've preserved most of your strength until the last moment when you're nearly upon the enemy trench, and only then rushing onwards to carry the position. Again, keep in mind that if everything is going according to plan, well, your artillery should be suppressing that opponent right up until you're close enough for that final charge. And distance isn't all. Between these trenches, of course, the nature of no man's land could range from pristine, untouched, rolling grassy hills with plenty of cover along the way, all the way to a lunar surface of muddy shell holes and corpses and tangled wire. In some areas, it might make sense to run, but in others, there may be no choice but to advance, even against enemy fire, with a slow, almost parade-like step. The nature of the ground itself is one of the most important elements behind how an advance takes place, and there is no one picture of no man's land that is, equal to the entire front. But that isn't all either. Perhaps the most key element is that of unit cohesion, the ability of an infantry formation to keep together in a predetermined fashion. Think about it this way. If you've got everyone all rushing as fast as they can to get to the enemy, well, not only will many of them be tired when they reach the enemy line, but they're going to be arriving piecemeal. The fastest guys are going to get to the enemy first, and they're all alone. The slowest ones, meanwhile, are getting left behind, and they can't lend their support to the battle. When men rush in too quickly, they lose cohesion. The formation, whatever form it happens to take, becomes disrupted. Whereas if you're going to have a chance at carrying your objective, you need to make sure that everyone is hitting the opponent all at once as a single, unified force piercing through the enemy's line. This is a principle that extends well beyond the First World War. Really, it's a key element throughout all of military history, from the ancients up until the modern day. Whoever can bring a more concentrated force to bear on a given point will typically win that point. It's also one of the main advantages that an attacker has, the ability to concentrate their forces on that singular point, whereas a defender has to be a little bit more spread out as they don't know exactly where that concentrated force is going to hit. And keep in mind as well that these formations that are attacking, they're inherently limited by, you've guessed it, the communications technology of the day. There are no field radios. All of these communications can only go so far as officers can see their men and as far as their shouting or their whistle blasts can be heard. In order for these often large and complex formations to be kept together, they need to move at a controlled pace, at least slowly enough to where everyone is able to keep track of where they are in the formation in relation to everyone else. At most, that typically means a controlled jogging pace. In military parlance, marching at the double quick. Keeping the formation together was also important because not everyone in those formations is necessarily going to be doing the same job, right? This is the kind of thing that's going to vary throughout the war, but alongside the riflemen, you might expect to see a machine gun section, you might expect to see a mortar team, of course grenadiers or bombardiers, all of whom are going to need to keep specific places in relation to everyone else so that they can fulfill their very specific and yet vital roles. If parts of your infantry are starting to reach the enemy lines, but half the bombers are still 30 yards back, well then you're going to have a bad time because you need a team of a bomber with a rifleman to clear portions of the trench, right? No soldier is acting purely independently, which means they need the guys on their team, on their section, on their platoon, whatever it is, they need to be together to fulfill their task. You can't have parts of them doing it on their own. Now, to that end, many First World War training manuals and treatises would really emphasize the importance of this unit cohesion. For example, we have the Manual of the Chief of Platoon of Infantry, first published in January of 1917, and which I'm going to be citing a lot moving forward. It explains how, whether the assault be delivered at the beginning of an action, as in the case of a platoon starting from its own trenches to attack the hostile trenches, or as the last act of progression conducted up to within short range of a hostile line, it always preserves the same character. The assault is usually a combined action of the whole, which is executed under the protection of powerful rafales of artillery fire. The attacking troops should always reach the enemy in a single rush. I added the word always there, I realize, but you get the point. It's important, right? The point here isn't to necessarily just walk the whole way, right? But to advance at whatever pace, given the circumstances, will allow the unit to keep together so that when they reach the objective, they can all rush in at full speed while still being more or less all together. Now, the exact size and shape and makeup of these formations could also vary pretty dramatically. Typically speaking, as the war went on, we see the scale of these units getting smaller and smaller, with more authority to make important decisions being placed at lower levels of command. At the start of the war, you might have like a one captain trying to command an entire company all at once with large attached support sections, if not even larger groups, like battalion scale stuff probably. But at the end of the war, we find independent platoons being led by subalterns, a lieutenant and whatnot, with more support weapons being integrated within individual squads. So the overall scale, so to say, of the decision-making, sort of the lowest common denominator, the lowest unit that you're going to find acting independently on the field, is getting smaller and smaller as the war goes on. And as those levels of command are shrinking, so too are the formations gaining more flexibility in how closely packed they needed to be in order for officers to maintain control over them all. After all, if you have 100 men that all need to be able to hear the commands of a single officer, 100 men all acting as one big unit, well, they're going to need to be very close, nearly shoulder to shoulder, if they're all going to be able to hear and understand those orders and move together. Whereas a group of 30, 40, or 50 men, well, they can be a lot more spread out than the 100 can be and still manage to, work as a team. Of course, you also, though, on the obverse, you can't make those formations too small. Why not just have teams of like 10 guys, because then you have ultimate flexibility. Well, you can't have the units be too small because when they actually reach the objective, they need to be strong enough to actually carry it, right? So there's this push and pull dynamic taking place here between ensuring your units are strong enough to fight the enemy, but also flexible enough to actually reach the enemy. And that debate over the niceties of exactly how much frontage each unit should maintain and how many men and how distant the files will be, all of that, it's going to rage all throughout the war. And ultimately, of course, that dynamic is still a key element to small-scale infantry tactics. This is a complicated science that, for the most part, the great powers of Europe were trying to figure out on the fly because they'd never seen anything quite like the Great War before. And, of course, every time they did decide to extend or condense the standard line of attack by, this many files or by that much frontage, well, every time you do a little experiment like that, just change a number, that costs lives. And it isn't like these armies had easy control over the other variables either, to tell whether the organization of their troops was working or not. It's like, in this battle we reduced the length of the frontage by 3 paces and we extended the depth by 1 pace. Yeah, but that was also the battle where the mine that was supposed to go off right when the infantry hit, well, it went off too early, and so that was all botched as well. So did our changing of the infantry formation really have that much of an effect? Well, it's hard to tell. Let's do 10 more battles using that same formation and we'll see if it works or not. It's complicated and it's dark. It's really dark. Now, the same manual as before provides one of these views on how you should form up the troops for an attack, explaining how, in this case, quote, "For the same reasons that the formation for approach of the platoon under artillery fire are generally the line of combat groups and column of files, the formation for combat of the platoon under infantry fire is the formation in 1 or in 2 skirmish lines. It is confirmed by the experience of recent combats that the interval of 4 to 5 paces between the men of a deployed line ensures the minimum of losses while maintaining sufficient cohesion. Consequently, to avoid having a front too greatly extended and on which it becomes impossible to maintain control, the platoon will be formed at the start, no longer in line, but in the direction of depth. The habitual front of the platoon is from 80 to 100 paces, 65 to 85 yards. Whether engaged as a unit of assault or as a unit of reinforcement, the platoon will be formed in two lines, generally called waves. The distance between these two waves will be from 10 to 15 paces. Another key reason why it was so important to keep this precise spacing would be that none of these units were operating in a vacuum, right? Right behind the first platoon is probably going to be another platoon, just as there would be others to either side of them, all up and down the line for potentially thousands of men, so that if units begin to slow or get bogged down, or if they veer off of their positions, well, then they can run into the lines of other units and they start to get all jumbled together. Chains of command can start to get confused, people end up going to the wrong objectives, and order begins to collapse. The First World War was a close-fought thing, and I mean that literally here, right? There was not a lot of wiggle room between units as they're fighting in these highly claustrophobic environments. Incidentally, I have a whole video on that topic as well, if you happen to be interested. But this is why, right, all of this is why, unfortunately, most of the First World War battle scenes that we see in movies and in games and whatnot are just complete nonsense, right? Even my beloved 1917, we just see the whistle blows and everyone takes off in this big old blob towards the enemy. I mean, yeah, the moment in the movie makes for great drama, but it also implies this kind of barbaric simplicity behind the tactics of the time that are simply not reflective of the reality. Instead, more often than not, as soon as men are going over the top, and if they get clear of any wire or immediate obstructions that are in front of them, well, then the men would have been drilled incessantly in how to immediately run to their places, to form up, find their places in the formation while going on the march. And then ultimately, once everyone is together, then they can determine, okay, are we going to move at a greater speed, right? Within these formations, it would be up to the officers to direct the formation, and it would be the job of NCOs to keep control over the men, ensuring that they are keeping their places and echoing the commands of the officers. Really, it's all very similar to how infantry would be moving in the 18th or 19th centuries, just with a much more open order and at a smaller scale. But again, really the same principles of cohesion and force concentration and how to direct large bodies of troops in chaotic environments, it's all there, right? It's all very much similar. It's all very similar. So all of that being said, in many circumstances, it made a lot of sense that these men would at least begin their assaults at a walking pace. But then that still doesn't really provide a complete picture because, well, surely, while sometimes it made sense for them to walk, sometimes it also really didn't. So what did people do in those circumstances? Did they just mindlessly follow the doctrine and walk steady on to their deaths? Well, we'll come to that all-important question right after a brief sponsored message. This video is sponsored by Manta Sleep and their Manta Sleep masks.
Well, hello there. Are you a diplomat to one of the great imperial powers of Europe in the early 20th century, sleepwalking through a series of overlapping and confusing treaties and secret treaties and handshake agreements and cultural ties and, oh, you get the picture. Remember that old Bismarck fellow? Oh, yes, what a character. But now old Willie's given him the boot, it seems like Germany might be getting a little bit uppity. I sure hope that doesn't lead anywhere dark. Well, until it does, no doubt you're having trouble sleeping at night, likely due to all those terrible lamps all over Europe. Oh, won't someone just put those out for once? Surely the trouble wouldn't be from anything else. Anywho, if you need to block out some of that light to sleep more soundly, might I recommend the Manta Sleep Masks? Oh yes, it's a lovely little piece. With its raised eye cups, it doesn't have any of that nasty pressure on your eyelids or lashes while you sleep, and it really is a 100% blackout mask. Just take a second to adjust it, and you'll not see any bit of that lamplight. They're also made out of a delightfully well-ventilated material, and are perfectly tapered even for those who sleep on their side. And of course, they say variety is the spice of life. Just ask the Austro-Hungarians. Ha ha! Oh, I'm sure their variety wouldn't cause any sorts of problems. And Manta offers all sorts of variants. They've got weighted masks and silk masks. They've got ones to cool you down or to heat you up a touch. They've even got one that plays music. Oh, what will they think of next? And if you'd like to pick up any of these beauties for yourself, make sure to act fast, because now, until the end of the year, Manta has their last chance sale, where you'll get up to 25% off of your order. Or use my code Brandon10 to get 10% off as well. Isn't that just swell? Oh, well, I like to think so. Thank you to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video, and now, let us forge on.
Now, yes, we saw it with the quotes at this video's start. Many accounts from this era will, either praise their brave boys for marching stoically into enemy fire, or likewise, they'll condemn it as utter madness. But you have to remember that the perspective of individual agents who are taking part in, or just observing these small parts of a much greater and largely incomprehensible whole, are always going to have a flawed perspective of it. What may seem like madness to a soldier on the ground could be necessary on a larger scale. Now sure, in some situations where the soldiers were walking, it absolutely would have made much more sense to run. You'll find a lot of things like that in the very early days of the war, right? And likewise, there are certainly situations where soldiers rushed into a place, and it probably would have been better for them to have taken things more slowly. Ultimately, our hindsight is much closer, at least, to 20/20 vision than anything the people on the ground, whose lives are at risk with every decision they make, how precise their vision could ever be, right? Determining precisely what actions to take and when, especially if they aren't rehearsed actions, and if things aren't going according to the plan, well, that can be difficult, and that can be deadly. It was always a matter of finding a happy medium of precisely how to pace out one's assault, and the approaches used would vary dramatically across different settings. Again, it didn't always make sense to run, didn't always make sense to walk. But overall, as the war went on and doctrines shifted, well, individuals at every level became more experienced in these new methods of warfare. Whether that would be the staff officers drawing up plans for how long they should expect the infantry to move from point A to point B, so that way they can figure out how long the artillery needs to be suppressing the enemy for and all that stuff. Or whether it's a lieutenant deciding when he should order his platoon from the quick time to the double quick, and then when to begin the rush. And by the mid to late war or thereabouts, well, most people were pretty experienced, and they were getting pretty good at making these decisions, right? The result, then, was never that soldiers would just be walking into enemy fire, but using different speeds at different points based on the situations that they're facing, understanding that they need to balance the considerations of timing and unit cohesion, and ultimately of survivability when they arrived at their destination. So with all that being said, let's look again to that manual, which can tell us a little bit about how the soldiers would prepare to face down these dynamic and stressful situations. Before the combat, the leader indicates the point of direction to the entire platoon. During the course of progression, he regulates the length and frequency of the rushes, as it keeps his unit always in good order and in good condition to fight. He profits by all possible shelter to reorganize his platoon and to get it again well in hand, using close order movements if necessary. Progression into combat is executed by 1. Marching without halting, 2. By long rushes at double time, 3. By short rushes at full speed, and 4. By infiltration, which is a topic for another day. In the first and second, so long as the movement is protected by powerful rafales of artillery fire, at long or medium ranges, the skirmish line marches without halting. Otherwise, it executes long rushes at double time, 50 to 100 meters. File closers maintain it then in strict alignment, particularly in critical moments such as under artillery fire. During halts, all consideration as to intervals and distances must disappear in face of the urgent necessity of utilizing the ground to the best advantage. And in the third, under fire of hostile infantry, the crossing of open spaces is executed by short and rapid rushes of 20 to 50 meters. In combat at close range, avoid making rushes before the point to be reached has been well determined upon and previously indicated to the skirmishers. And if that seems like a long distance to even rush against a machine gun, for example, well, remember that in open ground there is always more danger in crawling slowly towards a cover than in rushing to it very suddenly, exposing the whole body for a very short time. The soldier who does not advance immediately at the command, the soldier who lies down before he has reached the alignment of the halted line, commits grave faults which deserve the full rigor of the file closer. So as you're hopefully advancing under the cover of the artillery, have the men walk at a steady pace. And as you get closer, move to the double quick. By then you might be under small arms and artillery fire. And keep in mind the distances that are marked down there as well, up to 100 meters for starting the long rush, as they refer to it. That's a pretty long way, while under fire, to run and still keep the formation together, which is why, that long rush can't be done at full speed. Then, if possible, take cover at a predetermined point to reevaluate your situation and make sure that your men are in good condition for the ultimate final rush, at which point you take full advantage of your bombardiers and any other support tools that you have available, like a machine gun section, for example, to clear out sections of the enemy trench before that final mad dash, the whole formation together washing over the enemy position. Warfare is brutal. It is uncaring for the individual, but ultimately, in a setting so horrific as that of the Western Front of the First World War, it is the very sacrifice of individual preservation that allows the whole to survive. Now, not every part of that plan was always enacted in such a way. Again, different contexts demand different approaches. And it was all a massive learning process. But by the late war, alongside a whole slew of other technological advances like tanks and flamethrowers, gas, aeroplanes, and many others, of course, plus, of course, advancements in artillery techniques like the creeping and rolling and box barrages, and developments in wider infantry doctrines like bite and hold rather than trying to get a full breakthrough. All of that together with a great mess of political and social and economic causes, and then all of that in turn combined with the more simple questions like when to have your men walk and when to have them run, ultimately it was all of these factors that would win the war. So, did men just walk into machine gun fire? Well, yes, and no. They walked against the enemy positions when it made sense to do so, and they ran when it made sense as well. But when those things made sense wasn't always clear in the fog of war, and mistakes would be made, not only by the upper echelons of officers, drawing up the big plans, but also by individuals on the ground as well. They did their best. They didn't always get it right. But slowly over time, lessons were learned, and every year of the war looked dramatically different from the last, resulting from those lessons. Again, the War of 1917 was worlds away different from the War of 1916, 15, or 14. It was always understood, as it is understood today, that to carry an enemy position, you must concentrate your force upon it. Yet there is also a dynamic by which you cannot allow your concentration to create too large of a target before you're able to reach that position. At the war's beginning, we saw armies using the same techniques which had won wars for thousands of years prior: concentrated mass infantry frontal assaults. But as the war went on, the scale of command within those assaults was dramatically lowered, as so too were the complexity of the assault dramatically rising. In the end, the story of the Western Front is not a one of lions being led by donkeys. Instead, the reality is far more complex, and I would say it's far more interesting as well. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this topic, and specifically about how that organization of, in this case, the British Army, was changing throughout the war, with things like the command structure being lowered to the platoon level, and different kinds of support weapons being issued at different levels and different amounts and whatnot, well, I'd recommend the book The British Army Handbook 1914 to 18 by Andrew Rawson. You'll find it linked down below, and also on my website's recommended reading page. I'd also recommend you to look through the manual that I referenced a few times in this video, which you'll find alongside a whole bunch of other free primary sources as PDF downloads, likewise on my website in the digital library. My name is Brandon Fischella, and on behalf of the Native Oak, thank you for watching. As you've heard, you can learn more history and about all of my other work that I do, all by visiting us at nativeoak.org. Thank you, especially to the patrons, without whom I would not be able to carry out said work, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.